Welcome to Researchers, podcast show about ideas and quest for knowledge.
Got out of NSA as fast as I could because they started spying on individuals. Primarily, the main issue for us, legal issue, was the U.S. citizen issue. Like they started pulling in data about individual U.S. citizens.
Former NSA employee and whistleblower Bill Binney exposed changes in a program he invented to track U.S. enemies overseas. He says it was twisted after 9/11 to allow domestic spying, and he says it violated Americans' rights. He says he became a political target after that.
My son answered the door, and they pushed him out of the way at gunpoint and came upstairs and pointed guns at my wife.
Hello everyone, from your host Giuliano Marinkovic, and this is second episode of the podcast show Researchers. We are continuing with our trilogy. This will be the second part of our NSA and domestic surveillance trilogy. In previous show we had Mark Klein, AT&T whistleblower, the show that you can listen and you can catch up if you missed it. So on the similar note, today our guest will be NSA whistleblower, Mr. William Binney, who is very outspoken. There are a lot of his interviews floating out there. He had an impressive career in National Security Agency, over 30 years there. And he resigned in October 2001, and he was directly opposed to domestic surveillance policies that are still causing a lot of ethical debates. William Binney was part of the team who was designing the ThinThread program. The plan of this system was to achieve gathering of intelligence data, but in the same time also to preserve privacy. So, coming next, in a few moments, you will hear the interview, my archived interview from November 2013, when I was producing the TV show about signal intelligence and electronic surveillance. So, as I said, this will be the second part of the three-part series. So, buckle up your seatbelts. We will be back very soon. Before we start our interview with William Binney, I will tell a little bit more about signal intelligence, intelligence procedures, and the whole theory behind it. So let me just briefly mention that electronic warfare is a part of military science that can be divided in several areas. One of these is electronic interception, or SIGINT, signal intelligence, that can be additionally divided to two sub-areas, where we have COMINT as communication intelligence and ELINT, which is electronic intelligence. COMINT is nothing else but the communications that are intercepted, and they are used specifically in communicating between human entities, let's call it like that, used for direct communications of military institutions, different commercial institutions, and so on. On the other hand, electronic intelligence is more focused on the evaluation and interception of the emissions from machines or different devices. It could be in the form of different telemetry signals, radars, and so on. Also, we have electronic jamming, radiogoniometry, where we are able to pinpoint the location of the radio transmitter and maybe in such a way to evaluate the distribution of the troops on the enemy line. And also we have electronic deception, where different false information could be distributed through electronic means. The best example, I think, is World War II operation, Operation Overlord, known as Invasion to Normandy, where Allied forces implemented many deceptive procedures through false radio communications to make enemy to think that the troops are completely differently distributed than like it was in reality. So this is sort of a theoretical segment of electronic warfare. And now we can see that the border between the military usage of these intelligence procedures is not so clear. So this is a brief theory how everything works. And now I would like to send my greetings to William Binney, who is now with us on the other side of the line. And before we start to go into today's subjects deeply, which are NSA and domestic surveillance, I would like to ask Mr. Binney to give us expanded overview of his background. I do recall that I read and that I heard in many of your interviews that you were involved in intelligence operations during the Vietnam War. You were active in signal intelligence procedures, which led you in the end towards your overall career in National Security Agency. Please describe to our listeners how your career in these fields has started.
Okay, well, I started with in the Army in 1965, and I was initially sent to Turkey to serve a tour over there, so I was there for a year and a half in Turkey, and then they sent me back to NSA while I was still in the Army. So, and then I spent the rest of my time there. The point was that I was watching all the things happening in Vietnam simply because I had some friends there, you know. So I was concerned about that. So I monitored that, and I was basically still focused on the Soviet Union as the primary target I was working at the time. So then I got out of service in 1969 and came back to work. NSA wanted me back as a civilian, so I came back in early 1970 as a civilian. And then I worked there again, focusing mostly on the Soviet Union for about 27 years. And then I became the technical director of the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis and Reporting, and that meant basically the intelligence reporting for the world. So then I was working on that, and the problems there, that got me into the current digital world of communications on the internet and the wireless phone systems as well. So that's basically the background I had, and what I was working on throughout that period of time. That was 32 years basically as a civilian with NSA, and then 4 years in the military, doing SIGINT operations there.
Before we move to the issues of domestic surveillance, I think it is also very important to mention that signal intelligence procedures have a very rich history. And there was quite a lot of achievements that were made, especially in cryptography. During the Second World War, one of the most famous achievements was the breaking of the German Enigma code. And I can probably bet that there was a lot of things happening behind the scenes during the Cold War. Of course, without breaking any security clearances and in connections probably with some limitations that you still carry regarding your previous career. So within these limitations, it will be great if you could present our listeners some of these important achievements in intelligence history.
Well, you know, my understanding of the Enigma went like this. It was originally intended to be a German commercial encryption system. And so as a part of the process, they were having the Poles were manufacturing the equipment. And in the process of manufacturing it, what they were doing was, they'd number stamp each part as it came down the line, and keep upping the next one, be the next number up, and so on. So they'd have a number series of parts and could account for all the parts. But as a part of that process, the Poles didn't step the numbering scheme. In other words, they would print two parts with the same number in sequence, and then take the second one and let all the rest pile up and go down, you see, so that they could get copies of the Enigma device, the physical device, but out of the production in Poland and keep it there. Then the only issue was to get the keys, and that's what my understanding also is that the Poles were able to get some of the keys, and also read some of the Enigma when they were just before they were being invaded in 1939. And as the invasion came in, they knew they were going to be overrun, so they took their copies of the Enigma and gave it to the French and the British. So they had the physical equipment there. That's how they were able to get into it so quickly, is because they had the base equipment. Then the issue was only to find the key and discover the key. Well, on the battlefield, there are many ways to get the keys, from combat and material left on the battlefield. So that kind of thing helped them out there too initially, and then they got into the hang of how to recover the keys over and over again. And they built the bomb, which was a semi-computer to help them discover what keys were being used day after day. So that's basically the history of it. So
yeah,
it was really the Poles were the ones who really got us into it. So.
Yeah, and during Cold War, I guess there was many successes. If you want to mention any.
Well, it's just detecting things in advance and making sure that your leadership knew about them, like the invasion of Czechoslovakia, or the invasion of Afghanistan, or the threats during the Yom Kippur War, or any of those kinds of events. Where you needed to figure that out in it and be able to predict those kinds of things in war and leadership, so that they didn't make mistakes that would only escalate the issues or escalate the problems. And that's basically what the whole intelligence process is supposed to do. That's intentions and capabilities reporting of potential enemies. It's not the forensics issue like after the Boston bombing. It's not a question of going back and finding out who did it, how did they do it, and so on, so you could put them into court. That's the forensics police approach. For intelligence, since you were in it, the point is, you need to be able to predict in advance what your enemy was about to do, and what he was capable of, so that you can prepare to meet it or counter it.
Especially on the battlefield and on the tactical sense in real time too. So
exactly.
Thank you for this overview. Now we will fast forward the clock to the present, or to be even more precise, to the last few decades, where you were also a maker of the intelligence history. But let's first discuss about the technical problems that intelligence agencies all over the world started to encounter with the beginning of the Internet era. I guess the problem was directly connected with the fact that the traffic over the Internet was becoming higher and higher. During 90s, especially in 2000s, many different types of communications were moving to the Internet with different data protocols and so on. So just to directly intercept conventional satellite communications was not enough anymore. So you can introduce to us the ThinThread program. That was a very good project to solve that issue.
Yes, that was the issue, was the volume and velocity and variety of data being passed around, mostly on fiber optic lines, but also in other media, cables, standard cables, and like on the phone network and satellite phones and all that kind of stuff. So the whole idea was that there was so much information being passed around the world that we were having a difficult time coping with it all. And since the bad guys, the criminals around the world, and militaries and others, governments were starting to use that system too, so it meant that our primary targets of interest were embedded in this massive amount of information passing around the world. So we had to devise a way to be able to look into that data without having to look at the data, because there was too much there to be able to look at. So that was basically what we ended up with ThinThread, was first to acquire the information, and then to be able to look into it and select out, monitoring it, not taking all of it in, just selecting out that was relevant to an issue that we were working on, like terrorism or money laundering or dope smuggling and things like that. And so that's what we did. We were able to do that by looking at metadata of people who were communicating, and then building their social networks in the world, and then seeing which ones were participating, which social networks or groups or communities were participating in these various activities. And that allowed us to select out that information as it was passing by without taking in everything. You know, we weren't collecting everything. We were only collecting that material that was relevant to some sort of issue that we were working on. And that was the main difference from what they actually did afterward, because the system we designed would simply manage everything that you gave it, no matter how much you did it. We didn't see any limit in how much it could manage. So that's what they did. They said, okay, let's just take in the whole world and not focus in on things that we knew were involved with bad activities or criminal activities in the world. So.
Yeah, and your program was also developed within the agency without any outsourcing. The cost was very realistic in that sense, and it was a very powerful, kind of artificial intelligence program, because it created graphs and so on. So maybe a little bit on that path too, if you can tell us. The idea was, yes, the social networks are basically what's called graphing now. That is where you do, like if you called me, now you're in my graph. That means I have a link to you, and what it means then it simply takes links to everybody else that I call and links them together. Like I call you, I call another person A, person B, and so on. So then that linking shows my social network. Everybody that I relate to when I'm using the phone, and you do the same thing with email and banking and so on, or travel, and that kind of linking, travel linking or human contact linking or bank transaction linking, all of that basically puts together a social network that you're involved with in life, and so that's how we would be able to relate. And pull back together the terrorist networks and all those other illegal activities and all the networks that were supporting them. So that was for everybody in the world. We could do that for everybody in the world and had no problem being able to manage that level of data input. We could take trillions of transactions and boil them down to billions of relationships, and then pick out the networks that were important out of those billions of relationships and pull that data out if it was relevant to an issue like terrorism or money laundering or whatever. We would know how to index that and have those communities mapped out and use that metadata that defined them to extract it from this continuous flow of tens of terabytes a minute of data. And constitutional rights for domestic surveillance would be, of course, obeyed with ThinThread, right?
Yes, and also we didn't take any data in on individuals in foreign countries either, because that was easily definable by simply exclusion. If it didn't fit into our known sets of communities of activities of bad guys, we simply didn't take the data in. So it was basically a way of also providing privacy to everyone in the world.
Yeah, so there was no building of archive. Everything else was simply a noise, right?
Yes, that's right. And you wouldn't need things. You wouldn't need to build storage facilities like in Bluffdale, Utah, the big facility they're building out there, or the one they're building, another big one over here at Fort Meade. And there's another one down in San Antonio, and a number of others around the country and around the world too. So you wouldn't have to have all that storage because you wouldn't be taking in all the data.
And it seems that internal problems for you started after the 9/11. When General Hayden from NSA had completely different idea how to resolve these problems. What was happening during that era?
Yes, that's the main reason I got out of NSA as fast as I could, because they started spying on individuals. Primarily, the main issue for us, legal issue, was the U.S. citizen issue. Like they started pulling in data about individual U.S. citizens, as well as all other citizens of the world. And that's the part that I basically objected to, because it was a violation of our constitutional rights, And also, it was making analysts dysfunctional by piling all this data on them to sort through. So technically, there was a basic flaw in the logic to taking in everything, because their philosophy, I think, was taking in everything. If there's an issue anywhere, we'll have data to work on. And the problem with that is, if you use the analogy, they use the needle in the haystack analogy. If you have a haystack, it doesn't help to make that haystack 10 orders of magnitude larger, because that only makes it orders of magnitude more difficult to find that needle. And that's fundamentally what they've done.
Of course, another part of the equation is the outsourcing and the connections with giant corporations that were developing new programs for National Security Agency, while on the other hand, you and your team, you already had solution with the ThinThread program. Compare for us, please, the differences between your program ThinThread and the giant program Trailblazer that NSA was developing and which was never active in the end. What was the difference of expenses and cost between these two programs?
Well, ThinThread cost from scratch to develop it and have it deployed and functioning about $3,200,000. So the other program that you're referring to, I think, is Trailblazer, and that program cost a little over $4 billion and actually produced nothing. It had nothing operating.
You tried with your colleagues to alarm some other government bodies about this whole situation. So, what was the outcome in the end of your initiative that you started on that note?
Yeah, as soon as they started expanding to the individuals and collecting data on all the individuals, especially on U.S. citizens, that was a direct violation of our Constitution, and also on any number of the laws at the time. So the first place I went was to the House Intelligence Committee that's supposed to be doing the oversight of these intelligence agencies to ensure that they didn't spy on U.S. citizens. That was why they were formed back in the late 70s, because they came out of the Church Committee investigation of NSA spying on U.S. citizens. And that created the FISA law and the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and those committees and that court were created to ensure that the intelligence community agencies didn't spy on U.S. citizens or violate U.S. law. But that basically didn't function at all from the very beginning. It just everybody kept conforming to the law for a long time, and then. See, because they realized that the oversight of those agencies was basically a joke. The intelligence committees and the FISA court basically had no way of verifying anything they were told by NSA or FBI or anybody else, and they knew they were being lied to at various points in time. Like in August of 2002. The New York Times published an article where they realized that they had been misled for at least 75 warrants from the FBI. So that tells you they knew they were being lied to. They just didn't figure out a way to go back in and verify what they were being told. So it's that old Russian proverb, trust but verify, right? So the only thing they did was trust that what they were being told was correct, and they had no way to verify it.
So your complaints probably put you on the radar with your other colleagues too. Can you explain us the point in time when you decided to leave? I think your two colleagues, Mr. Loomis and Kurt Wiebe, and what was the aftermath of that? How the government reacted?
Well, they did any number of things. One, we all three of us there left the agency on the 31st of October of 2001. That was as soon as we could get out, the fastest way to get out of the agency at the time. And after we did that, we tried to go to, the techniques that we were using in ThinThread were also usable in any number of other kinds of large data approaches like Medicare, Medicaid fraud, stock market, banking transactions, all kinds of large data set analysis. So we tried to go into that and start a consulting business to get that going. And every time we got contracts or started on contracts, NSA and or the FBI had those contracts terminated. So we were basically being blackballed from any labor or work that NSA could influence. And then, of course, we kept complaining to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees and other members of Congress about the corruption at NSA, and using the classic case of Trailblazer as the point issue, which was really much larger than that. That was only one of the programs that these kinds of defrauding the public and just corruption between industry and NSA management. So after we filed then in late 2002, September 2002, we filed a complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and that one basically accused NSA of corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse, and laid out the case that we were stating, ThinThread and Trailblazer as the case to look at initially. Plus, it was a greater statement of the underlying culture at NSA and how it related with corporations. And the issues really weren't well known within the government because the government never audited. The Government Accounting Office was never allowed to audit NSA. So, in other words, this was all done in secret. And this was setting that foundation and basis for corruption that was persistent there over many decades.
Yeah, the government, based on all this data now that is out, simply said to NSA, here's a blank check, what is the amount? And many corporations jumped the gun, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, after they started spying on the individuals and U.S. citizens as well, after that, it just kept expanding over time. More companies became involved and so on. So that, that latest court order, the FISA court order issued to Verizon that was published on the web by The Guardian, I believe, or the Washington Post, and or both of them. It listed the serial number of that order as BR 13/80. That meant they put the whole business records, the BR business records, in one series of numbers. So, and it was for the 2013. That was the 80th order of 2013. That was the second. That was the second quarter of 2013. So that was the second order to Verizon. The first one, therefore, was further on in the number scheme, the lower number. But the way I figured it, they did the telecoms first because they were the first to join the business records transfer back in 2001. And then it expanded into probably banking and then into the service providers on the Internet. So that meant, and my guess was that of the telecoms, they were probably ordered AT&T and then Verizon. So that would mean AT&T in quarter one of 2013 was order number one, and Verizon was probably the next biggest telecom in the U.S. was probably number two. So that's 1 and 2. And that means that if Verizon is 2 in the first quarter and 80 in the second quarter, that there's up to 78 companies involved in this business records transfer. Now that should include all of the telephone companies and all of the internet service providers and probably some of the major banking system banks like the big ones in New York, and I don't know how far that went around the world. So it's hard to tell. But it looked like there was at least 78 companies involved in business records transfer.
Yeah, everything at the end culminated. You were raided by FBI, and can you describe how that all went and what was the reason and how it finished?
Well, as a part of our complaints to different people in government and the inspector generals, we also went to the Department of Justice inspector generals too. And so what that really did was made us noticeable. And so, after the New York Times exposed the spying program in December of 2005, they started an investigation to find out who leaked the information. Well, it wasn't us, but they knew that from all the metadata and contact systems and chaining and social network that they've been building. They knew we were not involved in that, but still, they got our names from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. They got our names as those who filed the complaint against NSA, and so NSA had that grudge, and they wanted to give us a little retribution for filing that complaint. So they got the FBI to raid us. In July of 2007, they raided us, and what it meant was a group of all four of us who signed the DOD-IG complaint, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, Diane Rourke, and me. Those are the four of us who signed the IG complaint, and we were the four raided simultaneously on the 26th of July of 2007. See, Diane lives in Oregon. That's on the far west coast. And all three of us live in the Baltimore, Washington area here. So they raided us here at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they raided her at 6 in the morning. So that meant time-wise we were all raided simultaneously. That was their coordinated raid, and they came in with guns drawn here in my house. They didn't do that with others, but so they had about 12 people go to each house, I think it was. So that was quite an investment for investigation for the FBI. They were all FBI agents. And they took our computers and electronic storage devices and some papers and other things and went away. And they kept investigating and so on, but never really charged us with anything. They attempted to frame us. That is, they tried to concoct a charge against us using falsified data. So they assumed that we did not have any of the data left, but when in fact we had most of what was there. We could recover from others or from our website online, and they didn't realize we had all that. And that's why we could defeat their attempts to frame us and maliciously prosecute us. So then after we got through with that was about 2009, by the end of 2009 when that stopped. And then they gave us letters of immunity to try to come in and testify as best we can for, telling them anything we could remember, which we did. We didn't really have any evidence on anybody that would implicate them in a crime, but so they then they were still keeping all of our material, see. So we collectively started a 41G lawsuit against NSA, the FBI, and the DOJ, Department of Justice. And our lawsuit was simply to force them to return our property that they took. I mean, after all, it's everything we created. Nobody in the government created it. And we knew that the law said that if they were going to keep anything, that they were to notify us within 60 days. Well, this was 2011, which is like 4 years later. We filed this lawsuit, and they haven't told us they were going to keep any of the material, so they violated that law too. So, and they really didn't want to. They never wanted to return the data. They just wanted to punish us for filing that DOD-IG complaint, which, by the way, is a part of the ground rules or rules for employment with the U.S. government is to report fraud, waste, and abuse and corruption, which is what we did. So, and the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense Inspector General found that what we had said was true, and that was published. And the NSA was able to redact about 98 to 99% of it because it was too embarrassing to them to have it exposed to the public. because of all the corruption and incestuous relationship with corporations and so on, and the waste and squander of money. I mean, it was just the resources were just squandered there. So they just continued with that and tried to keep the material, and they claimed in court under NSA an NSA Act of 1959. They were permitted to keep material because they deemed it sensitive, that they weren't obligated to return it, and that meant that they could keep it from view of the public. So that's what they argued, and unfortunately the courts agreed with them. So fundamentally it meant that they could keep whatever they had and not tell us what it is that they thought was sensitive, so we could argue against that. So we didn't have a chance to get due process on that, and they still have that material, so we've just given up on that, basically.
What was in that data? Some kind of notes or complaints that you copied, something like that?
No, it was just general statements about what they were doing without giving specifics. So it was sensitive in the fact that we were laying out the problems that they were, the corruption that was involved, and who was finding out about it, could verify it and testify to it.
Oh, okay.
So they didn't want that knowledge out.
Yeah, internal material from your group of colleagues, and
our emails and things like that, with not just between us, but also between others who have been investigating the same problems, like in NSA.
Yeah, I was shocked to hear that during the raid you were in the shower. Can you describe the emotions during the? I mean, it was really shocking to read that.
Yeah. Well, when they broke in, it was 9 o'clock in the morning here, and I was just getting up. So I was in the shower, and my wife was getting dressed, and so my son answered the door, and they pushed him out of the way at gunpoint, and came upstairs and pointed guns at my wife. And then I came in the shower and pointed a gun at me. So, first of all, it was pretty hard for me to believe they were doing that because I was participating with them. They had been interviewing me for since March of 2007. So between March and July of 2007, I was interviewed about 3 separate times for about 3 hours each. And I had been cooperating with them, telling them everything I could remember. So I was kind of surprised why they were doing this. The first thing came in is you kind of, why, you're asking yourself, why are they doing this? And then later on it became pretty clear that they were here to intimidate us, to keep us quiet, and eliminate any potential of us talking to members of Congress about the illegal programs, unconstitutional programs that President Bush and Vice President Cheney started with General Hayden and Director of CIA Tenet. Yeah. So that was the whole objective of them, and I basically accused them of that when they were here. And I also reported the crimes of those 4, Bush, Cheney, Hayden, and Tenet, how they were conspiring to subvert the Constitution of the United States and violate any number of laws. And all that is now just coming out the surface here. Like, now they claim that it's all legal, but the problem is it's only legal retroactively if you think of only the law, but if you take it into the Constitution, it is unconstitutional for them to collect that information about the U.S. citizenry, which means that any law that they pass, like the retroactive immunity to the telecommunications companies, that retroactive immunity they passed in 2008, and that was or 2009, one of the two, and it was to keep the companies from being from the lawsuits against all the telecoms to go into court, so that the telecoms would have to pay penalties for what they were basically ordered to do by the government. So, in other words, the crimes they were committing, they had to get retroactive immunity for, which is what Congress stupidly gave them. And then, so the issue is that no law can be passed that authorizes unconstitutional activity. That law, in turn, is unconstitutional, which means that it's not a law, which means the telecoms would, if we can get this into court and get a ruling on the constitutionality of it, then all those laws fall that defend them. Their entire house of cards falls, and all those telecoms are now legally liable.
Yeah, Constitution is a higher body.
That's the foundation of our government, yeah.
What is the aftermath now for you? You are very outspoken, you are present at many events that discuss the issue of domestic surveillance. Mr. Thomas Drake, another NSA whistleblower, is also out there. So what is the current status of your projects and your plans?
Well, we basically aren't working. I mean, they basically put us out of work. So, but we are basically talking about
in the public arena,
all the things they're doing.
Go ahead. I meant in the public arena.
We are speaking out at different conferences. Like I was just at the Oklahoma University Law School, and I was also on a television show, Bill Maher's show. And then there's various panels going on. I'm going back to Germany in January, in Munich and Berlin, to talk on different panels and give a talk on these issues there at the IT conference in Munich. So, and I came back from Vienna, where we're doing a documentary film, and then also I was in Switzerland earlier in September, giving a talk to the Swiss Polytechnical University. So I'm getting around trying to spread the word and explain the things so that the government here cannot bamboozle the public into thinking the way they want to without addressing the truth about what they've been doing.
Thank you, Mr. Binney, so much for the opportunity to interview you, and thank you for all the information that you shared with our listeners today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Nice to talk to you, too.
Yeah, have a nice day, and all the best to your family. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That is all what we prepared for our second edition. We will continue with the third part of this three-part series in the next episode. There we have quite a big surprise for you, and it will be a great conclusion of our trilogy. Thank you once again for your patience and for being with us today.